Welcome to Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young.
Hey everyone, welcome into an all-new episode of Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young. I am your host, Mike Leon. Clarke here is a seasoned family law attorney, a consultant, and he's been an expert witness helping courts and families navigate the realities of these high-conflict custody cases. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about why reunification therapy fails in some of these borderline families and why the therapy cannot override a pathogenic parent. Clarke's going to explain all of that in just a second because I'm the novice here. Clarke's the expert. Clarke, it's good to see you. So let me ask you, I mentioned the reunification therapy, and obviously you're going to explain this to our audience. What is it? I know it's presented a lot as a solution in these custody cases. And then what's the assumption with the borderline families? What assumptions does that approach, that reunification therapy approach, what does it get wrong from the start?
Thanks for having me, first of all, Mike. I really appreciate it. Reunification therapy has been, hotly debated for some time in California, at least, and I'm sure other places as well. There are some schools of thought that say that reunification therapy is not a real thing, and that it's something that the courts have just sort of made up along the way to try and deal with children who are estranged from one parent. The question gets more complex and convoluted depending upon the fact pattern. If you have a situation typical of a borderline case where, as I've said before, while not all parents who alienate children from the other parent are borderlines, it's always the case that all borderlines do alienate. So we have to make an assumption right off the bat here. Let's assume that we're in a court case where the court has come to the realization that the borderline parent has engaged in so much parent alienation for so long, and I'm talking 5-6 years, that the fruits of that behavior have started to ripen, and the child is now refusing to spend time with the normal range parent when the normal range parent has never said or done anything that would indicate that the child is estranged from that parent because of that parent's behavior. And that is a very important hypothetical that you understand the whole package there. At that point in time, you have to get someone very, very skilled. And I do have a team that I have where we are able to help with that reunification. And here are some very, very valuable pointers. If a court orders your child into reunification therapy with a therapist, and yet the custody schedule is 50-50 or 60% with the borderline parent, 40 with the normal range parent, or even 80% with the normal range parent and 20% with a borderline parent. The borderline parent can undo in about 2 hours with the child what the reunification therapist can accomplish in about 2 months. So basically, it's a waste of time and money. For judges to do that, it's just doesn't make any sense. What has to happen is there has to be an intensive period where the child spends with the normal range parent and hopefully a therapeutic setting. And they have these reunification camps. Again, there's a real debate happening in California about whether these reunification camps are good or bad for the child. Well, it depends upon the situation. If you're trying to reunify with the borderline parent, that's a whole different ball game, so to speak, than if you're trying to reunify with the normal range parent that the borderline alienated. So there's a lot of things in this that you have to parse out, and there's no one size fits all. The other issue here is the age of the child, how many children there are. Do different children show different degrees of parent alienation? lots of times this alienation begins at birth or age 1, and the child is totally unaware that it's happening, but the poison's being dripped in, and the fruit doesn't ripen for 5 or 6 years. And so what's happening is the court, again, I'm going to say stupidly and unfortunately, they're treating symptoms, not the underlying cause. By the time those symptoms arise, the child's already been doomed and destroyed. They've got major issues beyond the alienation issue.
Right.
But you're going to have a normal range parent who is basically willing to give their lives to help this child no matter what until they turn 18. And so you end up having to deal with all those complexities in the case.
Yeah. Clarke, I mentioned pathogenic in the intro. What does that mean to describe a parent as pathogenic, and why does that distinction matter?
The reason the use of the term pathogenic parent and pathogenic parenting is so important is because, first of all, normal children do not spontaneously develop pathological symptoms on their own, just by osmosis or something. Pathogenic symptoms only arise as a result of pathogenic parenting or other pathogenic people in the child's world, right? It could be other family members or schools or whatever, but mainly there has to be a pathogenic somebody imprinting pathogenic symptoms on the child. So when you start from that axiomatic axiom, you really you see certain things. So I've always said to courts up front that you want to hire experts to evaluate the situation, so do I. But when you actually are talking about who is expert in knowing the non-normal range parents' behaviors and what they do, my client has been in this interpersonal relationship with them for 3, 5, 10, 20 years. They are actually the experts. I know you won't qualify them as experts because they don't have a degree, but they have a PhD and beyond when it comes to understanding the behavior and describing the behavior and how that pathogenic parent relates to the child.
Mm.
So the idea of using the term pathogenic parent also sometimes at the earliest stages prevents the attorney who's representing the normal range parent from having opposing counsel stand up and scream in court, Mr. Young isn't a psychotherapist. He isn't an expert. He's testifying as an expert, as a therapist. Well, no, I'm not. But I do feel I have a PhD in borderline personality disorder, even compared to most PhDs. I don't pretend that or think that when it comes to other psychological diagnoses, but when it comes to borderline, I've been there, I've done that, I know it inside out better than most psychologists. But I can't argue that in court. That's just, I'm saying that on this podcast, that's just the reality of where I'm coming from. So I have to be careful, and so does every other attorney, where you don't diagnose somebody on day one. So how do you deal with that? You basically look at the DSM-5 criteria for borderline personality disorder, and you ask your client to draft declarations that describe what's happening in those terms, so that at some point the court or the psych evaluator or the child custody evaluator or the child's therapist or the school counselor, anyone who's versed in psychology, will look at those declarations and realize that what they're looking at and what's being described is someone who's a borderline. So it's kind of a game you have to play with the court, because the courts want to, they've got their formal rules of how you go about things again, and you can't just say to the court, make an exception in this case.
So, Clarke, let me ask you about the reunification therapy again. When a child's placed into that reunification therapy, does that kind of change this burden of repair? And if it does, who ends up carrying that burden?
When it comes to, assume that you have a reunification order of some kind, and there are two kinds of those orders. The first one is where it's going to be your child goes in and sees a therapist. who claims to be a reunification therapist one times a week for an hour. Uh, Again, the court's going to order both parents to make sure the child participates and that sort of thing. But I frankly, as I've said before, that doesn't work. The borderline is 1,000 miles down the road further in their skill sets for undoing whatever the reunification therapist accomplishes. So the child is going to remain alienated under that scenario. So actually, you could say theoretically that the normal range parent has the burden of making sure that the child is getting to therapy sessions and doing all that. But at the end of the day, it's not doing much for the child, in my experience. If you are able to get an order where the child is put into an intensive weekend long or a week long or whatever it takes long reunification um, therapy setting with someone who really is qualified, uh, that has great promise. And quite frankly, if someone is really skilled, I don't think most people realize this. If somebody's really skilled at what they're doing, maybe because they were an alienated child themselves that became reunified with their mother or father or their estranged parent, um, they're going to be able to help that child or that family all together, And sometimes the borderline parent is brought into the setting, and everyone is working together for a long weekend or a week where all the relationships get recalibrated. And this is an art form. This is something that happens. It's almost on the level of a miracle when you don't know that it's out there. I mean, it's like when you see it happening in real life, you go like, I can't believe this happened. That is followed up by other sessions to reinforce that, and there are guardrails put in place to make sure that if any of the symptoms, the pathogenic symptoms of parent alienation begin to show up in the child again, then the pathogenic parent's time with the child is cut back until the symptoms subside again. That's probably the biggest takeaway of this part of the podcast, is that you have to follow through and follow up. And of course, the burden to do that is either going to be on the court, or if the court delegates that authority to a degree to the primary parent, that primary parent can actually work with a therapist to say, well, uh, borderline parent, you've been alienating the child again. The child's beginning to act in ways that are symptomatic. We're going to cut your time temporarily. You have to have that flexibility. That's what I call a conditional custody order.
Yeah. Clarke, have you seen in that example, piggybacking on that, have you seen often where therapists and courts misinterpret the child's resistance as alienation rather than, the child just doing a form of self-protection?
Oh, it happens all the time. I would say in the majority of the cases that I deal with, uh, the, the the child, usually around age 12, around adolescence, sometimes pre-adolescence, but certainly by 12, 13, 14, if it's the same sex child as the borderline, the borderline imprint is in there in addition to the alienation. And it is very often the case that that child is alienated from the normal range parent. Um, no blame here, but the normal range parent probably should have gotten the divorce or the child custody proceeding moving 10 years before then. But that's water under the bridge. You can't do anything about that. Um, Nevertheless, there are cases where you have to distinguish between parent alienation, which is what I've been describing, when one parent coaches and brainwashes the child into thinking that the other normal range parent is a threat to them or dangerous or doesn't like them or doesn't love them or doesn't care about them. That's one set of facts. The other fact pattern is when um, your client is actually the parent that is acting in ways that the child, just to protect the child's self and uh, distance themselves from the child. And that is really estrangement in the technical sense. That is when a child becomes estranged from a parent because of that parent's poor parenting. And so those are the two different scenarios we have to distinguish between estrangement and parent alienation.
Clarke, what patterns have you seen tend to emerge after there's been repeated therapeutic failures in some of these cases that you've worked?
Well, I'm not being facetious here, but the number one pattern I see is that the child turns 18. They age out, and then the court loses jurisdiction over the child and over the family, and the kid just muddles through life with core wounds that will never heal. Um, and those core wounds, if it's a borderline imprint, or if it's the opposite sex child and they have ADHD and depression and anxiety disorders and self-identity issues and all those kinds of things. Um, I mean, I hate to say it, but the child will never experience as an adult a normal range relationship. They just won't. They just can't. So that's normally the most common thing that happens. Prior to that, it, it's all happening on a spectrum, right? Uh, if the courts were responsive and they treated borderline cases like they do domestic violence restraining orders right now, where they get the A team in there on day one and they set up some guardrails and they act quickly, you would save children, millions of children who are the offspring of borderlines and narcissists. And so the older the child gets, the more entrenched the pathology becomes. And after age 4, 5, 6, you're probably going to be, how can I say, helping the child deal with the borderline imprint that they've been given. And maybe they'll only be very mildly borderline rather than moderately severe, but you're still dealing with a child that has been uh, permanently imprinted with a problem. And I don't want to get too far away from this question, but
Right.
you look at what's happening in society right now, and you can see that in the political sphere and in the social sphere, uh, this country is having an epidemic of borderlines and narcissists. They're basically, I would say, destroying society, not just their family.
Yeah. Clarke, as we kind of wrap on this episode, for the courts and the professionals, what needs to be understood about why the structure and the containment, maybe not necessarily the therapy, are the prerequisites for any future healing?
For future healing for the child?
Yeah.
Well, number one is you got to get an attorney who knows what they're doing. You have to pray you get a judge who's open-minded about these things and aggressive, actually very, very aggressive about this. You have to hope and pray you don't get a borderline attorney or something on the other side that is makes the case twice as difficult, twice as expensive. But beyond that, you need to get other players involved in the child's universe. The child needs to find, and as well as the parent, probably the normal range parent, they need to find therapists who are skilled in dealing with borderline personality disorder. That's a subject for another day. Uh, the next thing you need to do on the list is you need to make sure that everybody in the child's universe is aware of uh, the psychological dysfunction that's going on. Again, this is a discussion for another day, but um, the court system is set up to protect the guilty, and you're not supposed to disclose the psychological valuation of the contents of it to anybody. Meanwhile, you're in court debating and talking about the psych eval, and there's a transcript of it. So where does the confidentiality get dropped out? But it's sort of a fiction that's going on. But in so many words, in so many ways, the child's teachers and coaches and therapists and other family members all need to be brought up to speed on what they can do to help the child deal with the borderline parent, because the goal isn't to destroy the borderline parent or remove the borderline parent from the child's life. The goal is ultimately, with a conditional custody plan, this is the only way it will ever work, by the way, is that you keep bringing the borderline parent back into the family unit and introducing them over and over again to the child when they are not acting in a pathogenic way towards the child. In other words, if I'm talking to a borderline right now, I would say, when you're having a bad day, call up the other parents and just have them come and pick up the child, and you can do a makeup day. No big deal, easy peasy.
Right.
All right, because we all have bad days, and there's nothing wrong with you. You're just having a bad day like everybody else. You're perfectly normal. And that's how you have to talk to a borderline, but to get them to do what they need to do for the child, because you can't say to them, don't you see you're harming the child? Oh, no, 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 they're perfect. You can't say that.
Right.
So the court can, and the court should say that. And the court should say, I'm not going to put up with any of your shenanigans, borderline. I don't want to see your face in this courtroom ever again. But if you do come in, I'm going to be taking a hard look at your behavior, not like I did a year and a half ago when I thought you were saving your child from a monster, which turned out to be the opposite of what was happening.
Right.
So those are the sorts of things you can do for the child in a remedial way outside of the reunification context.
Yeah. Clarke, thank you again for the time, the insights, and breaking this all down as always. I appreciate it, my friend.
Good seeing you. See you next time.
That's it for today's episode of Vampire Divorce. If you want to learn more about Clarke's work as not only a family law attorney, a consultant, an expert witness, like he's mentioned, in these high conflict custody cases, do me a favor right now, visit clarkeyoung.com. One more favor before you go, hit like, hit subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with somebody who may be going through this exact scenario. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.